is an extract from my forthcoming book, Blood and Coal, which is about my own mining family. And this is about my grandfather, who was born in 1898 and who died in 1978. I remember him very well. And his name was Francis Rockley, but he was called Chum by everybody. And I'll just read this section on him. And in the end, he comes back and he makes a riposte and rips into the narrator, me, saying you got it all wrong. Because the idea is, of course, to make the reader think about the nature of evidence and how you understand another personality. Chum was astonishingly handsome and tall, and he was the apple of his parents' eye. He was conscripted to World War I at 18 and survived. He replaced the youngest son as the favourite in everything. The best potato, the best bed, the last and strongest tea in the pot. His father even saved his nub ends for him, fashioning them with some effort into fresh gaspers. Chum was encouraged to feel that he was destined for great things and could do anything, and this extended to the world of high culture, from which he and all his kin were excluded. He was walking past the Albert Hall in Nottingham one day and heard the strains of a classical concert. That was the day, he said, that I first knew I had a soul. He could barely read, but he knew beauty when he heard it, and for the first time in his life he saved up for concert tickets when he could. Perhaps it made him feel vulnerable, because when he came out of the concert hall, his soul could be seen in his face. With such aspirations and tastes, the pit was bound to seem like a come-down. Chum toiled there after World War I, but hated it and its accompaniments. The dirty fingernails, the blue scars on the white skin, the hacking cough, the underground pallor. Moreover, miners had a traditional style of courtship and mating, and such rituals were not for him. He wanted a mate who was unusual. He wanted a life that was cosmopolitan. He wanted fitted suits. And so, in the early 1920s, he applied to become a customs officer in Shanghai, paying someone else to fill in the application form, and he was appointed as a junior customs clerk. The uniform made him seem brisk. He never wanted to polish buttons before, but now he did. Chum always waxed lyrical about China. There were ladies in Chongsans, there was a sweet perfume everywhere, and the trains seemed to run right through the streets. It was like nothing he had ever dreamed of, and Shanghai's political and religious system was no more foreign to him than that of home. He had been excluded from official culture there as well. The sheer intricacy of the Chinese artefacts was fascinating. He bought an ivory ball which contained other separate carved balls inside each other. They could all move independently. It made a soothing sound as it lay in his pocket, and he thought that somehow that was the rattle that the world made. Impenetrable, autonomous. He could pretend that he owned it. That was the lure of empire, to encourage outsiders to feel that they could get away with anything. And for a while he did. The Rockleys had taught him that morality was for fools, and that there was money to be made in Shanghai, he knew. He began to permit a degree of opium smuggling. He turned a blind eye to the secret caches of the white gold hidden in ladies' pockets, in donkey saddlebags, in hollowed-out Bibles. He was found out, of course, and dispatched home ignominiously. I thought to myself, well, China is dead to me, but forever after that he carried the ivory ball in his pocket. Another world. When he got back to Nottingham, He felt as though he had somehow been bundled back there. He tried the pit again, but he had developed a taste for luxury and style, and even if it meant the ignominy of going into service, it was worth it. So he left for London, as so many had done before him, and became a butler. Chum knew nothing of polite society, but he could learn. 1920s upper-class households only functioned there with a hierarchy of servants, and there were many opportunities. The ladies' magazines were full of information about etiquette, the right method of cleaning cutlery, the correct way to lay a table. By close observation, Chum realised that it was quite easy to control the servants below him and to corral them into deference. And he never told us how he landed a post with a rich family in Bedford Square. The house was big and cold, and no one knew their place, but I did. He loved female company, and his handsomeness and air of authority made him irresistible. The posh ladies liked me, but I was more comfortable in bed with my own sort. In the Bedford Square house there was a tweenie called Florence. Small, frail and beautiful, her job was to hump coal to the bedroom fireplaces, to carry hot water without spilling it, to do the more menial kitchen tasks. She rarely spoke, and then in a whisper, Chum took her hand. It was red and raw. I thought to myself how pretty she was, and how little she knew. Florence seemed somehow exotic in Chum's eyes, though not as exotic as the Cheongsam ladies. She was alone in the world, with no one to object to an early wedding, and so the butler and the tweenie married. There is no record about how they felt about each other, although later on they always spoke of each other with implacable hatred. Florence quickly became pregnant and was ill, and so they decamped to Nottingham to Hannah and Joe's house. Their daughter Josie was born. There were few butler posts in Nottingham, and Chum had to go down the pit again. To his great chagrin, I had to ride back down into the dark to feed them, but I thought to myself, this was for the last time. The lure of London was strong, and as the 1930s progressed, the servant market altered. Far more workers, male and female, went into industry, and so there was a shortage of servants, live-in ones particularly. People who were prepared to go into service could pick and choose. Hannah, his mother, had taught Florence how to cook meanwhile, and so she and Chum sought posts as cook and butler. And here was the rub. Florence was of Jewish origin, though she knew nothing of the faith. But Chum had heard about a post in a large Jewish household and told them that his wife was an accomplished kosher cook. He was untroubled about the lie. Rockley law was that everything could be managed or evaded. The enormous fib never troubled him, although he always confused Saturdays and Sundays after that. However, the great house did not permit servants to bring their children with them, and so they deposited Josie, my mother, with her grandparents, and hardly saw her for years. This perhaps was when Chum's personality began to harden. He knew it was wrong to abandon Josie, unlike his other misdemeanours, none of which he thought were his fault. He began to think of himself as covered with cicatrices. The blue scars of the pit were overlaid criss-cross by the old wounds he could not bear to look at. When he looked back at the 1930s, he did not recall political crises or international events. He said, I opened a lot of bottles of port and polished a lot of spoons. I could only smell the inside of the house, not the outside. However, politics began to impact on him whether he liked it or not. The rich family had heard about the fate of Jews in Europe, and so they decided to emigrate to South Africa. Chum and Florence packed the family's belongings, the crystal glasses the ritual candles and returned to Nottingham the day war broke out. The city was a major target, and it was the first to develop an air raid precaution system. Chum saw his chance. He was too old for conscription, but was fit and well set up, and he became one of the few full-time wardens. Again, the best was the uniform, a well-cut overcoat, a jaunty helmet. It conferred power. It was Chum's task to coordinate local defence activity. It made a change, he said, from supervising and lighting fires in the rich house. Now I had to put the fires out. There was a sexual bonanza during World War II. After all, the possibility of being blown up at any moment tends to lessen people's moral scruples. And Chum, handsome, authoritative, with his powerful torch and stirrup pump, was well nigh irresistible to lonely, frightened women. He had tired of Florence. Her timidity and fractiousness had begun to pall. Why had he chosen a Jewess anyway, and one who seemed to hate his body? So he embarked on a life of riotous adventure. One of the women seemed more of a keeper, though. Her name was June, and she brought about the end of his marriage. The roads were dark during the blackout. Florence was out looking for her husband. She heard his cough, loose, phlegmy, a smoker's hack. "Chum, is that you?" she called. And as he loomed out of the darkness, she saw he had a plump young woman on his arm with bobby pins in her hair and a cigarette dangling from her lips. Chum said, "You may as well know. June and I are going to be married after the war." And that was the great chasm between an imperfect family life on one hand and a precarious, solitary future on the other. He had passed the Rubicon. After that, Chum felt that the vagabond life, so favoured by his family, had claimed him at last. June came to nothing. Florence applied for a legal separation, since divorce was too expensive. His daughter Josie got married and had a child, myself. But somehow he felt unconcerned about them. They were heavy baggage. He thought that freedom was best. And after all, he could turn his hand to anything. He'd never learned to drive, but nonetheless he applied for a job as a chauffeur. The uniform was the thing again. Cap, gaiters, gloves with holes over the knuckles. And as for driving, well, how hard could it be? He practised a lot with the Daimler on the flat open roads outside the city, and in the end became reasonably proficient. But like all his family, Chum was a wild drinker. And one day in his cups he tried to drive the Daimler up the steps of the country club owned by his employer, who he called Uncle Willie. Being cool and unfazed was almost a religion with Uncle Willie. "It's no good going in there, Chummy. They're closed on Mondays." Leaving the car teetering on the balustrade, Chum thought discretion was the better part of valour, and so gave up being a chauffeur. But his former good luck was beginning to desert him, and risk-taking was no longer paying off. He asked his rich sister Ethel for a job, and she employed him as a gardener. After all, he thought again, how hard could it be? But the Rockleys now had few tribal memories of nature or its management, and Chum left a trail of horticultural carnage wherever he went. He killed the precious greenhouse vines, he pruned the roses. Wrongly, he thought that weeds were just as good as expensive plants. The crisis came when he accidentally poisoned the pond and killed his sister's beloved goldfish. Ethel presented him with the little corpses on a doily. "Admit it, Chum, you killed my babies." His rejoinder was that anyone who had fish as children was crazy, especially as they had once run a fish and chip shop. That was an unfortunate remark. By this time, age and ill health were beginning to rear their heads. Once so handsome, his face was now seamed with grime, and his body kept producing 7-headed carbuncles from nowhere. He was homeless, and so his sister Josie took him in. But as he had deserted her so long ago, she had few reserves of love for him, and she and her daughter Susan, myself, began to hate him. Their little house hummed with loathing. Josie built him up again until he was functional, and then encouraged him to leave. He then took a caretaker's job on a hotel in Ilkley Moor. There are few fragments or speech acts from that time. Chum perhaps began to feel that the new world was conspiring against those who were poor, but who still had style. He rarely thought in former times that compassion mattered, but dimly he now began to think that he had been wrong. The new job at Ilkley went well enough for a while. He tapped the beer barrels, he served the Yorkshire puddings in the bar on Sundays, he swept the floors. He had a room at the top of the hotel where, as ever, he smoked in bed. One night his bedding caught fire and he awoke to find his bed in flames. It spread with great rapidity. He escaped onto the roof and was rescued by firemen. He had a stroke on the roof and the hotel burnt to the ground. He survived for a while in a nursing home. Josie, whose husband had died, visited him now and then, and the last sentence he uttered to her was, "I'm sorry about Freddie. Did you remember to bring me some fags and 20 quid?" Here is Chum's own voice. This is Chum's riposte to me. "You know, you've made me angry. You are my flesh and blood, my granddaughter, but you've made me out to be much worse than I was. None of it was my fault. None of them ever showed me how to love. None of them was ever proud of me. Florence was like a wet week. I tried hard, but she would never open to me. The ladies in Shanghai centred my mind. You never mentioned all the times I went up to Nottingham Castle and looked at the paintings and tried to see my own life in them. You never mentioned my spats, my white gloves, my gaiters, my gauntlets. You never mentioned how bright my hair was, how I could entertain people with card tricks, how I always folded my clothes up before I went to bed. You have used me for your own narrative, to make your own villain. You ought to be ashamed of yourself." I hope you enjoy these stories, and if you did, it would be nice if you could like and subscribe, and also in the comment box if you'd like to suggest other sorts of stories you'd like me to read, or what you like or don't like. That would be great.